The night my mother-in-law found out I was keeping records, she smiled at me across the dinner table like she always did, warm, practiced, the kind of smile that takes years to perfect. I smiled back, and I thought, she has no idea how much I already know. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without understanding who I was before all of it happened. I was 28 when I married my husband. I was a junior forensic auditor at a mid-size firm in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of job where you spend your days following money trails that other people tried very hard to bury. I was good at it, quietly good, the kind of good that doesn't announce itself. My husband used to tease me about it. He'd say I had the most suspicious mind wrapped in the most trusting face he'd ever seen. I thought that was a compliment. I held on to it even when I probably shouldn't have. We met through a mutual friend at a birthday party, the kind of casual introduction that doesn't feel like it's changing the entire course of your life until months later, when you're lying awake realizing it already has. He was funny and easy, and he looked at me like I was the most interesting person in the room. I fell hard, I fell fast, and I married him 14 months later, in a small ceremony with 30 people and a cake my own mother baked herself, because the bakery quoted us more than our first month's rent. His mother did not attend the cake tasting. She said she had a migraine. Looking back, that was the first sign. Not a dramatic one, not the kind you'd recognize in the moment. Just a small, quiet withdrawal that said, without words, this wedding is not something I'm choosing to celebrate. His mother, I'll call her what I always called her to her face, which was nothing warm, because she made it immediately clear that terms of endearment from me were not something she had any interest in accepting. She was a woman in her early 60s who had built her entire identity around two things: her late husband's real estate portfolio and her absolute unquestioned authority over her only son. The portfolio was worth somewhere north of $4 million. The authority over her son had been decades in the making, and she was not about to let a 28-year-old auditor from Dayton dismantle it. She was never overtly cruel. That's what made her dangerous. She was the kind of woman who offered to help, and then used the help as leverage. She paid for our first car when we were stretched thin in the early months of our marriage, and then mentioned that car, casually, in conversation, no fewer than 40 times in the following 2 years. She cooked dinner every Sunday and made my husband's favorite dishes, and when I'd offer to bring something, she'd say, "Oh, you don't need to bother, sweetheart," with a tone that made sweetheart sound like a very gentle dismissal. She asked about my job with the precise amount of interest designed to make me feel like my career was a charming little hobby. She was generously tolerating. I tried. I want to be clear about that. I tried for 2 solid years to build something genuine with this woman. I showed up every Sunday. I brought flowers. I asked about her garden. I sat through 3-hour dinners where she directed every question to my husband and spoke to me mainly through him, as if I were a foreign exchange student who hadn't quite mastered the language yet. My husband saw none of it, or he saw it and couldn't name it. I'm still not entirely sure which one, and I've spent a lot of time sitting with that uncertainty. The real trouble started when I got pregnant. We hadn't planned it exactly, but we hadn't been preventing it either. And when the test came back positive, I sat on the bathroom floor for a full 10 minutes, just feeling the weight of it. The joy and the fear and the strange specific terror of knowing that new person was about to enter a family dynamic I was already struggling to navigate. My husband cried when I told him. Happy tears, genuine, unguarded, the kind of crying that collapses a person down to something very simple and true. I loved him in that moment with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. We decided to tell his mother at Sunday dinner. My husband wanted it to be a celebration. He bought sparkling cider so I could feel included in the toast. He was thoughtful that way, in bursts, in the moments that required obvious thoughtfulness. It was the slow, sustained kind he struggled with. I remember exactly what I was wearing. Dark green wrap dress, my hair down. I had spent longer than usual getting ready because some part of me, some auditor's instinct for reading a room before you walk into it, told me I needed to feel armored. We sat down. His mother had made pot roast. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and something underneath it that I could never quite identify. something chemical and faint that I'd noticed before and chalked up to cleaning products or a particular brand of candle she kept near the window. Halfway through dinner, my husband reached across the table and took my hand. He looked at his mother and said, "We have some news." She put down her fork, he told her. His voice was bright, a little nervous the way people get when they want someone to be happy and they're not quite sure they will be. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at me and then she said, "Are you sure it's yours?" The table went quiet. My husband made a sound, a short, choked sound, like someone had pressed something against his windpipe. I didn't make any sound at all. I felt my face go very still in the way it goes still when I'm processing information that doesn't fit the model I've been working with. She said it calmly. That was the part I couldn't shake for weeks afterward. Not viciously, not explosively, calmly, the way you'd ask someone if they'd lock the front door. A reasonable question that deserved a reasonable answer. My husband said, "Mom, what are you talking about?" She picked her fork back up. She said, "I'm just asking. You don't know this girl the way I do. This girl. I was his wife of 2 years. I was 29 years old. I was sitting at her table in a dark green dress eating pot roast. I set my napkin on the table. I said very quietly, "I think I need some air," and I walked out to the back porch and stood there for 4 minutes in the November cold looking at her dead garden and breathing very carefully in and out. My husband came out after me. He said his mother didn't mean it the way it sounded. I said, "How else could she have meant it?" He didn't have an answer for that. He put his arm around me and said we should go back inside, that she was just surprised, that this was just how she processed things. And I went back inside because I didn't yet fully understand that the most dangerous thing you can do with a person like his mother is to let them learn, through your own accommodations, that there are no real consequences for what they do. The weeks after that dinner were strange and quiet. His mother called my husband every other day. When he'd get off the phone, he'd be distracted, a little distant, pulled somewhere I couldn't follow. When I'd ask what they talked about, he'd say, "Oh, just checking in." I started to notice that the calls happened when I was in another room. I was 12 weeks pregnant when I started getting sick, not morning sickness. I'd already moved through the worst of that. This was different. A low, grinding nausea that hit me every Sunday evening, without fail, within an hour of having dinner at his mother's house. I mentioned it to my OB at my next appointment and she said some women stayed nauseated well into the second trimester, which was true, which was also a very reasonable explanation that kept me from asking a more uncomfortable question for another 3 weeks. The question I eventually asked was this: why was it only Sundays? I'm an auditor. I follow anomalies. I don't arrive at conclusions until I have evidence, but I also don't ignore patterns just because the implications make me uncomfortable. The pattern was, I felt fine every other day of the week. I felt ill every Sunday night. The variable between Sunday and every other day was dinner at my mother-in-law's house. I started eating before we went, small things quietly, a sandwich at home, a handful of crackers. I stopped accepting anything to drink at her house except water I poured myself from the tap. I was careful about it. I didn't want to be wrong. I didn't want to be the kind of person who accused their mother-in-law of something unthinkable based on a gut feeling and a pattern. 3 Sundays after I changed my habits, I felt fine. The Sunday after that, I accepted a cup of herbal tea she offered me because I let my guard down, and because the weather had turned cold, and because she handed it to me with such practiced warmth that for just a moment I forgot what I was paying attention to. I was sick before we got home. I called my doctor first thing Monday morning. I told her what I'd noticed. She was quiet on the phone for a moment in the way that doctors get quiet when they're choosing their words carefully. She told me to come in that afternoon and to bring my husband. The blood work came back with trace amounts of something it absolutely should not have contained. My doctor used a word I had to ask her to spell so I could look it up. It was a compound found in certain herbal supplements, not acutely dangerous in small doses, not the kind of thing that would show up obviously, but potentially harmful to a developing pregnancy over sustained exposure. The kind of thing a careful person might add to herbal tea in amounts small enough to explain away. My doctor asked me, gently, whether I had any idea how it might have gotten into my system. I said I had a theory. My husband, sitting next to me, said nothing for a very long time. The drive home was the quietest 40 minutes of our marriage. I stared out the window and waited. I had learned by then that pushing my husband to speak before he was ready produced nothing useful. He needed to arrive at things in his own time. I used to think that was patience. I understand now that it was avoidance dressed up as temperament. He finally said, "It could be a coincidence." I said, "I know you need it to be." He said, "She's my mother." I said, "I know." We didn't fight. That was almost worse. We just sat in the separate rooms of our own understanding and couldn't find the hallway between them. I had installed a small camera on the back porch 3 weeks earlier, one of those discreet devices that looks like a smoke detector. I'd told myself it was for general security. I hadn't examined that reasoning too closely. The camera inside was not legal to use without disclosure in Ohio, so I had one question I needed to answer before I took any next steps. Did I have anything that mattered on the exterior footage? I reviewed the recordings that evening while my husband was in the shower. I found what I was looking for on a clip from 5 weeks prior. His mother, on her own back porch the Sunday before I'd started limiting what I consumed at her house. A small glass bottle, her hands moving quickly, then the bottle going into her cardigan pocket, 14 seconds total. Not conclusive on its own, but enough. I made 3 copies of that footage before I went to bed. The next Sunday, I did not go to dinner. I told my husband I wasn't feeling well, which was true in every sense that mattered. He went alone. He came home 2 hours later and told me his mother was hurt that I hadn't come, that she was worried about me, that she wanted to help with the pregnancy in any way she could. I said very carefully, "I need you to hear me right now. I need you to hear me and not defend her, or explain her, or ask me to see her side. Can you do that?" He said yes. I told him everything I knew. The pattern, the blood work, the footage. I laid it out the way I lay out audit findings, with dates and evidence and a clear logical chain, no drama, just data. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, and I watched his face move through 6 or 7 different expressions in the space of 2 minutes. Shock, disbelief, the specific grief of someone being asked to see something they've spent their whole life being protected from seeing. Then he said, "Maybe there's an explanation." I had prepared myself for that. I had audited his likely responses the way I audit financial records, looking for what the numbers would probably show before I ran them. I was still devastated. I said, "I need you to decide who you're married to." He said that wasn't fair. I said, "I know it isn't. Do it anyway." I went to the police the following morning, without him. I brought the blood work results and the footage, and a written timeline I'd prepared over the previous 72 hours. The detective I spoke with, a woman in her mid-40s with the particularly focused stillness of someone who has heard many unbelievable things and learned to reserve judgment, listened to me without interrupting. She asked precise questions. She did not look at me like I was hysterical or exaggerating or manufacturing drama for unclear purposes. She said they would look into it. I want to pause here and tell you what it feels like to report your mother-in-law to the police while 14 weeks pregnant, while your husband has not yet fully chosen a side, while every instinct you've spent your whole life following is telling you this is right. And the entire architecture of the life you built is telling you it's about to cost you everything. It feels like jumping from a very high place and not knowing what's below you. But I had data, and the data said I had no other option. The investigation moved slowly in the way that investigations do. My mother-in-law was not arrested that week or the week after. What happened instead was a search warrant, executed quietly while she was out. They found the supplements, they found online purchase records. They found in a folder on her laptop that she had not been careful enough with, a series of searches that, taken together, told a story she was not going to be able to explain away. In the meantime, I moved out of our house and into my sister's apartment across town. My husband called every day. Some days I answered, some days I didn't. He was in the worst kind of pain, the pain of someone who loves 2 people and has discovered that one of them has done something that makes it impossible to love them both at the same time. I didn't stop feeling compassion for him because of that. I just stopped making it my problem to solve. I was 19 weeks pregnant when his mother was formally charged. My husband called me that evening, and he cried for a long time on the phone, the different kind of crying from when I'd told him about the pregnancy. This was not the uncomplicated joy of that kitchen moment. This was grief, complicated and total, the sound of a man losing his mother in every meaningful sense, while the biological fact of her continued existence made it impossible to call it what it was. I sat on my sister's couch and I held the phone and I let him cry, because that was the most honest thing I could do. He said, finally, "I should have believed you sooner." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." What happened next is the part of this story that people always assume was easy, because the ending looks clean from the outside. It wasn't easy. The months that followed were the longest of my life. The legal process was slow and stressful and required me to revisit things I would have preferred to move past. My husband and I attempted couples counseling, which surfaced things about our dynamic that were uncomfortable to look at directly. I had two beautiful, healthy children in March. Twins, a boy and a girl, born 6 weeks early but strong, remarkably, almost aggressively strong, as if they'd already decided who they were. I held them under the heat lamps in the NICU and I thought, you almost didn't make it here because of someone who was supposed to love you before she even knew you. And then I thought, but you made it anyway. And then I stopped being sad and started being something else. Something that doesn't have a clean word but lives in the same neighborhood as fury and gratitude, and the particular fierce determination of a person who has decided that what nearly happened is never going to happen again. My mother-in-law pleaded guilty. Her attorney advised it once the digital evidence was fully developed. She received a sentence that, in my opinion, was shorter than it should have been, and an opinion I expressed to no one because the outcome was done, and I had two infants who needed my attention more than my feelings about sentencing guidelines did. My husband and I did not stay married. That is the part that surprises people the most, I think. They expect the story to end with reconciliation, with him heroically choosing me in some dramatic final scene and the marriage stronger for having survived the fire. Real life is quieter than that, and less convenient. We sat across from each other in a counselor's office 18 months after the twins were born, and we were both honest about what we saw, which was two people who cared for each other but had discovered, in the worst possible circumstances, that caring is not always sufficient. He was a good father. He remained a good father. We built a co-parenting arrangement that worked because we were both more committed to our children than we were to our own wounded pride, which I think is the most loving thing either of us managed to do. I went back to work when the twins were 4 months old. I applied for a senior position at a larger firm downtown, the kind of position I'd been quietly building toward for 3 years. I got it. 6 months after that, a colleague and I began the initial conversations about starting our own practice, something boutique and focused and built exactly the way we'd always thought it should be. 2 years after that, we opened our doors. I'm standing at my office window right now, the kind of window I used to look at from the street and think maybe someday. And I can see the city spread out below me in the particular flat light of an Ohio autumn. And my twins are on the floor behind me, building something out of wooden blocks that keeps collapsing and rebuilding and collapsing again, and every time it falls, my son laughs like it's the funniest thing he's ever seen, which right now at 2.5 years old, maybe it is. My mother-in-law is out now, served her time. I don't know what her days look like, and I have made a deliberate and ongoing choice not to find out. She exists somewhere in the world, and that is the extent of my relationship with that fact. People ask me sometimes if I hate her. It's a reasonable question, and I take it seriously every time it comes up. The honest answer is that hate requires a sustained attention I'm not willing to give her. What I have instead is a clean and careful distance, the same distance I keep between myself and anything that's proven it can't be trusted near something I love. What I want to tell you, what I've spent the last 4 years learning at a cost I would not have chosen but also would not trade away, is this: the people who are supposed to be safe are not always safe. The relationships that carry the most social expectation of loyalty are sometimes the ones most worth interrogating. You are allowed to follow the anomalies. You are allowed to trust a pattern even when the conclusion it points to is one you would do anything to avoid. I am not the quiet, accommodating daughter-in-law who sat through 3 years of Sunday dinners trying to earn approval from a woman who had already decided I was a threat. I am the woman who read the data, followed it to its conclusion, and built something from the ground up that no one else has the authority to take from me. My son just handed me a red block. My daughter is holding out a blue one, waiting. I put them both on the foundation they're building. The structure is still standing.